Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the Overpowered webinar. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mark, and today you're going to hear directly from Patrick Mills, the CEO of Overpowered, Jeremy Stein, the co-founder and CEO of TTFN Games, and Daniel as well. Sorry if I got your name here, Daniel DeKerlegand.
Very
Um,
good.
the was it so before architecting studio os, Patrick worked on AI infrastructure for the Department of Defense. He navigated bureaucratic friction, shifting military commands, and unsurprisingly massive regulatory delays, but he delivered ahead of schedule and under budget, an incredible rarity when we're talking about military stuff. And Jeremy brings us a unique operator perspective on the challenges facing game dev today. And I think this is something a lot of people watching are going to be real familiar with real quick. From rising production costs and longer dev cycles to the growing need for AI enabled infrastructure that can help studios operate more efficiently. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded. We encourage you to submit questions throughout the presentation using our Q&A feature. We'll reserve time at the end for a live discussion and for audience questions. Um, Also, I got to give you the boilerplate Reg CF disclaimer because this is regulation crowdfunding. This presentation is for informational purposes only. It doesn't constitute an offer to sell or a solicitation of an offer to buy securities. Any investment opportunity discussed is being conducted pursuant to regulation crowdfunding, and investors should review all offering materials. Don't worry, I'm going to add a link available on the official funding portal before making an investment decision. With that, let's get started. Take it away, Patrick.
All right. So, as Mark said, my name's Patrick Mills. My friends call me Rick. My background is in venture capital law, but as he stated, also in working with startups, having started multiple companies and dealt with AI and AI infrastructure with the Department of Defense. So, we're now taking those learnings, those that experience, and working to apply it into the video game industry. So what we have to present to you today is a company called Overpowered Inc. And the solution that we are building at Overpowered is called Studio OS, and it is a gaming lifecycle management software platform. And we like to think that it is the infrastructure that will fix this $200 billion industry. So why is there a need to fix something in the video game industry? Well, the AAA industry is in a financial death spiral, and here are a few really outstanding examples of recent problems, recent nine-figure losses that are going on in the industry that you may or may not be familiar with. So I think most people on the call would be familiar with Sony, whether it's for video games and PlayStation or their films or their other technology. So Sony worked on a game called Concord. Concord launched. It was so unpopular, they realized almost immediately there was no way they could fix it. They shut the service for the game down in 14 days after launch. The highest estimations of their losses for this game, $400 million. Embracer, you may not be as familiar with. It's a Scandinavian group. They built their company primarily through mergers and acquisition, essentially buying a bunch of studios and rolling them up into one company. They did so much that they ultimately realized we don't know how to control costs with the current environment in gaming. We've got to make cuts. That led to 7,800 layoffs and 80 projects that were in development being canceled. Ubisoft, very huge game company, recently had a massive operating loss reported, $1.2 billion dollars. They've also been scrambling to cut projects and costs to survive. And then finally, and this is recent in the last 2 months, Epic Games. Most people know Fortnite, one of the largest games in the world. If you aren't playing it, maybe your sons or daughters or your grandchildren play it. Their overhead to operate the game exceeded the actual revenue they're bringing in, and that led to 1,000 developers being cut. So really, across the board, this industry is seeing problems for a variety of reasons. But when you cut away and look at the ultimate, foundation of their problems, it's that their legacy 5-year development model is mathematically broken, and that's what we're looking at fixing. So, what do we as Overpowered bring with the solution that we're developing? Why, what do we understand about the market that other people don't, right? Silicon Valley is investing in lots of AI tool companies that are purporting to solve problems that the game industry has. So, what I would argue is that Silicon Valley competitors of ours, competitors generally in the AI market, see a basic point wrapper, something that just calls over to a Gemini, a ChatGPT, a Claude, uh, as a solution, right? These things automate creativity. We don't want to do that. We want to empower the creators. We don't want to replace them. And so we're building sovereign infrastructure that automates this friction, and it's designed to save AAA studios tens of millions of dollars per title. And we do that through four basic modes. So the first is that's 100% private and secure. So we use technology that is based on a small language model rather than a large language model. So your Claude, your ChatGPT, those are large language models or LLMs. Small language model is, as you might think, just it's smaller, right? So because of its size, you can fit it on a computer as small as a Mac Mini, and it can sit and it can live in your business's office. So you don't end up putting, say, a massive unpublished game like Grand Theft Auto 6 out there in the cloud where hackers, journalists, anybody interested might get access to it and release things about it before they're ready to be released. So that cybersecurity, is significantly less of an issue with just the way that we're architected. We've also built an automated chain of custody ledger into our technology. And this is important because as of today, the US copyright does not, they don't assign copyright to AI generated material. So if you put in a prompt to generate artwork or code or any other element that you can put into a game, you just don't own that, right? And so, our system is designed so that when people work with AI, when they integrate that into their operations, they're going to maintain their copyright, right? There's going to be an appropriate level of human, the basic of what's being built is going to have been built by humans, right? And the AI part is solely going to be a productivity tool that makes it go faster. And so you maintain your copyright. The third are budget locks, right? And this comes down to the way that you determine what you're going to build in Studio OS means you're deciding you're in your scope up front and then you're sticking to it. And when we look at a lot of games and why they go massively over budget or they ultimately build something over 5 to 10 years that the market then doesn't want, right? It's because of scope creep. And that's something that veterans have told me about, whether it's internal with a creative director or they themselves, or with executive coming down and saying, hey, what about adding this, right? Uh, and lastly, infinite runway, right? So typically with enterprise company, SaaS company, software, you know, you're spending all this money to scale your users, right? But you're spending investor money to do that. So we, learning from our march through what they call the Valley of Death between contract cycles in the military, we realized you can't just rely on investor cash, right? You have to have something coming in commercially. And so we've built into how we generate data for companies around what should they build, a B2C revenue stream that over the first 12 months of our company post-launch will grow to where it covers the operating expenses of the company. And this allows us to continue to operate without the need for significant additional investor capital. And all this leads up to an end-to-end mathematical de-risking of game development. So what is the solution? The solution is Studio OS, and it's an enterprise gaming lifecycle management platform that's powered by, as I discussed, sovereign on-premises AI, and it's driven by three live data vectors. So this is the special sauce, right? This is how we help people know what to build, right? Whether it's the macro scale of like, what genre should we build in? You know, we know what's hot now. We can look at data on Steam or some other platform and what's selling, right? But what's going to be popular in 3 to 5 years when this game actually launches, right? Is this particular path we're taking appropriate? And again, set up not to, you know, restrict or overcome the actual creative employees' decisions, right? To arm them with data so that they can make better decisions, but ultimately their own decisions. And the same thing with executives, right? Should I put this microtransaction into this game, or is that going to break my, my customer's goodwill? And so these three paths, right? One is synthetic wind tunnel, and that's where we're using an agentic mesh to measure the market, and that's purely synthetic, right? So that's it's not live people, it's mirrors of live people. Then we have a predictive radar, and that's where we're measuring and using predictive analytics on current social sentiment within the market. So think Instagram, TikTok, etc., all the standard channels. And then finally, your real world telemetry, right? So this is, hey, we have active consumers that, we have, and they're under an NDA or something else appropriate, and we're putting in front of them, live narrative, live mechanics, lightweight games, etc., to look at and then provide their feedback. And that's, where we're getting the live data from. And this, again, all goes back to the premise that we are not automating creativity, we're automating friction. We're trying to make these employees' lives easier and more productive. We're not looking to replace human employees within gaming. And so what does this ultimately look like? Well, so here is a high fidelity mock-up of what we may look like when our UI UX is finished. And Jeremy, who is on the call with us today, is actually, the one who will be responsible for building out the UI. He and his hand-picked team of experts from the game industry. So this shows some technical stuff, and that's interesting. And, you know, this may or may not mean anything to the audience, but really what this is doing is showing, you know, it's showing how this particular piece of artwork is fitting into the game that it's going into. And this is actually human generated artwork that I had made for a novel that I wrote a few years ago. And then the other major element here is Lorelei. She's a character from my writings that I chose to uh, visually represent our AI assistant. So the idea of our AI assistant is really to neutralize office politics, right? So all the research around AI says people are more willing to accept advice, criticism, etc., from AI than they are from another human. Because they look at AI and they go, it's a machine. It's not telling me I'm bad. It's just relating whatever the math is to me, right? So the idea is you've got the AI assistant, and when, something doesn't work and the system, the behind the scenes part of the system sees it, it's going to report it to you in the character of the game that you're building, right? So I mean, if you're Nintendo and you take this on, right, and you're building a Mario game and you're the creative director for that game, and Mario's telling you, hey, man, your math doesn't work. Are you going to be angry at Mario? Probably not. I mean, maybe. Like, I mean, I can't speak to every, individual out there, but that's the assumption that we have that we're going to be testing as we build this. So let's continue on and get into more of the business and the financials of this company. So this is an overview of our business model. We have three different basic revenue channels. So we have an enterprise license. This will be targeted towards AA and AAA game studios. If that doesn't mean anything to you, think of it as smaller games and larger games. You know, the medium budget, really big budget. And so the big takeaway here is because we're using the sort of on-premises technology that we spoke about earlier, you know, this has a zero variable cost, right? This is a capex, you know, capital expenditure, right? You're going to pay what you're going to pay upfront based on the size of your budget, and that's it. If you have to add more users, that doesn't change what you've paid, right? You know, if you have more times you're using it or fewer times you're using it during the production, that doesn't change things. And this is important. So there, in the last couple of weeks, there was an Axios article that came out about a company, not named, but you know, had to have been a major company. They racked up a $500 million Claude bill in 1 month because they didn't have adequate controls on their employees' use of that cloud-based LLM. So, you know, needless to say, you put AI into a game or into your production process, you don't effectively scope it or you don't have those controls, you could very quickly blow away your budget, right? And now we cut people, we have a smaller team, and we still end up spending more money. The second is what we'll technologically call runtime AI hooks. So this is in-game AI, right? This is your, hey, we're using AI in some way to advance the immersion, the elements of gameplay, right? And again, this is a flat fee basis. You're going to pay X amount of dollars based on the size of your game, and this is going to go into your game. And again, this is just something that's going to be in the code, right? So this is not pinging the cloud. There are no tokens when your users use something that, you know, uses the AI in game. It's just, it is what it is, and you're going to know what the cost is up front. The last is our IP discovery engine. So this is what we use to validate intellectual property in-house and for our clients. And this is also what we use as the basis for, you know, our indefinite runway engine. So, you know, think of this as a pass, like, you know, you're on, like you're paying what you're paying for Netflix and you can watch all the movies you want, right? So, you know, we've got, you know, a dozen or so different imprints. Imprint is a word used in the print media publishing space for a particular flavor of what they publish certain types of books on. So you'd have an imprint for your detective novels, for your romance books, and so on. And you know, so this is where we'll push our lightweight games, our you know, our ebooks, our audiobooks, and you know it's just a slow drip of direct to consumer dollars that will cover the costs of the company. And so we'll move on. So this is our go-to-market plan. Really not that complicated. Okay. So as we, you know, finish this campaign, we get to the point where all the features are ready for a company to actually be working on, you know, working with, you know, we have our initial pilots already signed. Those pilot partners are TTFN. Their CEO is right here on this call with us, and Noctua Interactive. That's another AA studio, and their CEO, though not here, is another one of our signed advisors. He's in this presentation on the campaign page, etc. That Noctua is his fourth startup. All three were previously successfully exited for both himself and his investors. So, you know, very successful lifelong entrepreneur. So once we've gone through those initial pilots with our, let's call them our friends and family studios, we will move to the friends of friends and the local market, right? So Louisiana is not the largest market in terms of game studios, but we do have, uh, we have EA Sports that has a presence in state. We have AAA studios like In Exile, who makes the Wasteland series. They're a Microsoft first-party studio, meaning they're owned by Microsoft. Um, and we have a variety of other studios from indie level up to making more significant games. Um, and then finally, when we get into the early middle of next year, we're looking at full launch and we're looking at, focused on, you know, advisor warm startup, warm introductions, not to startups, but to the significant AAA level studios and unleashing our fully built enterprise sales team to start working on those major contracts, the contracts that will make or break the ultimate exit of this company for its investors. And then, of course, the bedrock is, as we talked, that B2C discovery engine and the cash from that. And our internal forecast, is that we can scale this to 35 million in ARR by year 5. And that's a reasonably conservative estimate. That isn't like an aggressive estimate. Um, Not saying that that's a given by any stretch, but it is perfectly reasonable when you break that down by number of actual subscriptions necessary. I think it's about 250,000 subscribers, something along those lines. So we'll move from there to our competitive analysis. I mean, we've gone through the technology, the case for the technology, and the business model. So now, what does the landscape look like? Well, so nobody's really building something this uh, you know broad right now. People, as we described with, competitors in Silicon Valley earlier, most of what they're building are much smaller tools, right? They're going after one small part of a much larger problem. And so when we look at this competitor matrix, right? You know, you can see kind of what are, legacy publishers, right? What are they doing? The only thing that they're doing that they don't need Studio OS for is if they're not adopting AI, they don't have the legal risk of using AI, right? But they don't have any of the benefits of AI either, right? And in most cases, their investors are really heavily twisting their arm to take on AI. So like Square Enix, who that may or may not mean anything to you, but they publish massive game series like Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and so on, games that go back to the 1980s. And they have a Singapore group with $750 million or so exposure into the company, and they're really pushing the studio executives to take AI on. And so their management is scrambling. The second competitor on this list, Predictive Capital, right? So these are people using AI to help make investments in games. And by and large, from what we can see, uh, you know, they're using AI to look at trailing data, right? So say something like the last 5 years of Steam sales. Steam, if you're not familiar, is the primary distribution channel for PC games. So they're mitigating their financial risk by using data, but they have no control with execution risk, right? I mean, you can look at what's likely to sell, but you can't control purely by looking at that trailing data, whether the team that says, "Hey, we're going to build this game," and you go, "Oh, this looks like a game that would sell," but that doesn't guarantee that team will actually execute on that build or execute it in scope. Um, and then thirdly, generalist AI, and so that's your faster wrenches, right? Your tools that let you build an asset faster, that should let you script the individual lines of code in a game faster, right? So they have no financial risk mitigation. There's no execution risk mitigation. Like they can build a game faster, that doesn't guarantee that it's fun, right? They have no basis for actually protecting the assets, right? So you build a really cheap mobile game, but you don't own it. Well, guess what? Like the pirates are gonna get their hands on that really fast. Um, and so, with Studio S, right? We've got bases in here for financial risk mitigation for studios. We've got bases for execution risk with all of our predictive AI, right? We talked about our chain of custody, so we have our legal risk mitigation, and then we have a continuous QA, uh, you know, to limit your sustainment costs post-risk. And so this is just sort of all goes back to trying to point out that, Silicon Valley has this blind spot, right? They want to have a fancy accelerator. They want to take guys right out of the Ivy League who are like 22, 23 years old, and they want to put them in a daycare center. That's what I'll call their accelerators. And they basically want to throw darts at the board and go, if we throw enough of these darts, one of these teams of kids will eventually pay off, right? That's fine if you've got hundreds of millions of dollars to invest, but you know, that isn't going to actually solve the problems that this industry has, which are structural around their business model. It's not just, hey, we can't build these assets cheap enough. And so as we've gone into, our edge is we've got an end-to-end solution that's sovereign on premises and addresses risks that this industry faces across the board. Moving on. So here's our management team. If you can't see us on camera, here's a couple of our pictures. Maria is our third uh, manager, who she's not here today, but so for me, a little bit about me. As I said, my background is in venture capital law. I've spent most of my life advising entrepreneurs or being one myself. Previously built as CEO of a startup and a co-founder of a defense consulting company, a variety of infrastructure for the U.S. Air Force Lifecycle Management Center. So my background, it truly is in lifecycle management, what we're building for the gaming space. And, if you know, there's no real reason most people would be familiar with the Air Force Lifecycle Management Center, but that's the part of the Air Force that's responsible for actually maintaining our planes, right? So think about, if you watched the last Top Gun movie, right, you should be familiar with some of the more modern fighter jets that we fly, right? So, think from when they're building it, right? So the concepts of what goes into it, when a Boeing or a Lockheed is designing it, through manufacture, through the training of the pilots, and then the maintenance, right? The mechanics that work on them, to how do we get parts that we need when a plane is 20 years old and, we need to replace something on it, right? And those are all, very complex problems. You Building games, not that different. It's a similar process. It's just different stuff that you're building. Um, Daniel, I don't know if you want to kind of chime in and talk about yourself here. I mean, I don't want to talk for you when you're here on the call.
Sure, yeah. So my background is as much in creative endeavors as it is in computer science, but both of those are pretty extensive. So as Patrick included in the slides, I have an MFA in creative writing. I have a degree in English. I have a degree in film. I worked as a professor in English. But then I pivoted not in every way. In some technical senses, I guess you could say I pivoted to getting a PhD in AI, but it was also a direct trajectory in terms of creative work. So, what I have built in my research, what I have studied, is a hybrid neurosymbolic AI that is centered around creative work and how do we incorporate human creativity with AI in a way that doesn't degrade or water down human creativity, and how do we make AI as transparent and as collaborative as possible, to make it an ideal tool for the creative process and not something that actually erodes the creative work that human beings should be doing. And so I think that one thing that really distinguishes us is the fact that we have this very theoretical background in terms of neurosymbolic AI and the way that we built out our infrastructure that differs from a lot of these other competitors who are making essentially wrappers around Claude or wrappers around other frontier models and are attempting to sort of replace the creative work that people do rather than augmenting it and adding, these kind of superhuman tools that creators can use to do what they do best. And so that is what we're trying to do is try to give people the advantages that they need in order to compete in in an increasingly complex kind of world as creators. So yeah.
Thank you for that. That was really good. So, as I said, final co-founder Maria Morales, obviously not here on the call with us today, but so this is someone who's an early stage scaling veteran. She goes back to having been, one of the early numbered employees at Under Armour. So I mean, she lives up in the Washington D.C. area. She's been a journalist in the gaming space. She was the CEO of a mobile games company. So someone who brings a lot of operational experience in this to, do those nitty-gritty things like, hey, we need to be set up to actually publish on this platform, right? Like that's, you know, it's stuff that you just have to do, right? Like it's not fun, it's not exciting, there's no parade for doing it, right? But it has to get done. And, so that's who within our team covers those sorts of things and frankly keeps me tethered to the ground, right? So that I don't fly off into space with a bunch of crazy ideas. So then additionally, we have a set of strategic partners and veteran advisors. So for partners, two of those are the game companies that will be our initial pilot partners. We've talked about them. TTFN will also be developer for our UI UX for the final iteration as we go to market. And then the final strategic partner is a company called NOLA AI. If you're not familiar with the NOLA acronym, that stands for New Orleans, Louisiana. So they are a New Orleans-based AI startup. They are a platform level technology for small language models, and they are basically the technological basis of what we are building on. They're the company that allows us to have an on-premises solution as opposed to a cloud-based solution. This is what allows us to be something greater than just an AI wrapper. And, veteran advisors, Jeremy, we've mentioned he's on the call. He had a very nice introduction from Mark, and thank you again for that, Mark. Uh, Nathan, I mentioned when we covered Noctua and his background, and then finally Rick Neal. Rick Neal was one of the co-creators of Madden, has dozens and dozens of credits as a person in the game industry as an executive producer type, and really just you couldn't ask for somebody with more experience to advise you and give you a check on what are you doing and know everyone under the sun in this space that you could possibly ever need to know. Uh, so great team, great partners, fantastic advisors, and we are very appreciative of everyone, whether they're on this call or not. And so that's it. That's overpowered. We run the math and we know. And that's the idea. Within any stage of gaming, it really is about the data. And again, it's not about automating the creativity or the decisions of the creatives. It's about providing data that allows them to do their jobs better with less stress, less friction, and greater productivity. And with that, I'll turn it back to Mark to go into our Q&A.
Sure. I'm going to cheat a little bit because I have a question.
Okay.
Um, okay, here we go. I've been playing games most of my life now. I have very fond memories of being in college, having a spiral bound vault guide to survival for the original Fallout on my desk. So my question is, okay, guy like me is actually in the prime age for investment in crowdfunding. I have these fond memories of companies like Interplay, Microprose. You know, how would you seek to appeal or to connect to like a gamer like me who's looking, to invest, who's interested in an AI angle for making great games?
Well, for those who are, I mean, we're probably similar age. I mean, I don't, no need for me to lie. I'm 45 now, born 1981. So I grew up with a regular Nintendo, then a Super Nintendo, and so on. Probably played similar games over the years. I actually had, you know, while we were doing the defense work, the pleasure of meeting one of the two founders of Microprose, Bill Steely. He was a Air Force Academy graduate, pilot, and it just sort of intersected with some of the things we were doing with the Air Force. And, he invited us to come and play one of his games with him online and fly planes with him and stuff. And, it was cool, right? Uh, and so I think there's a mix of a nostalgia play, a legacy play, right? I mean, most people our age have kids, they might even have grandkids. Uh, whether you still play games today, new or old, right? Or you have kids, grandkids, you're just looking at the world out there, right? I mean, over 90% of Gen Z play games on their phone of one kind or another, right? Like we live in a world where gaming is ubiquitous, right? Everybody does it, you know. I mean, it's just a part of life, right? This is an opportunity to ensure the future of that industry. I mean, think about, I mentioned in our talk the stresses from activist investors that Square Enix is under, right? Man, this is, you know, this is a combined studio, Square and Enix, they merged back whenever, right? Goes back to the early days of gaming. They control IP that goes back to the early days of gaming, and then other things they've done with people like Kingdom Hearts, where they mix their own characters and Disney's characters that are beloved by millions and millions around the world, right? If they can't solve their problem, right, that, hey, we've got these shrinking margins and they go out of business, what happens to those brands, right? They're not just going to disappear, right? But who knows what will happen? Will somebody else manage them right if it's not the studio that actually birthed them, right? You know,
I think we can all imagine a world where like some of our most beloved IPs are bought up by venture capital and sort of turned through the meat grinder. And I don't think anybody wants that to happen. Um,
I-
uh, but if I could ask, I have another question here. For this one for Jeremy. Um, uh, Jeremy, you've worked on franchises like Fall Guys, Subway Surfers, Merge Dragons, and Panda Pop. So you've got a wide variety of experience. What would you say the biggest challenges studios face today compared to, I don't know, say 10 years ago?
Well, I mean, part of it's the changing landscape. 10 years ago, it was kind of figuring out how to make the transition to mobile for a lot of the bigger publishers, how to move to kind of a live ops world. Today, the big transition is a lot of it is cost and a lot of the globalization of games. And some of those solutions and some of it is being put on AI, but part of it is how do you adopt AI? So we're in a world where live ops is a thing. When I say terms like live ops, I mean you've got a game where you've got events that are running, things that are happening. It's operated much more like software as a service for a lot of these games, and then it's called games as a service. And so that's a very important thing. How do you integrate AI in a way that is ethical and does not crush you in terms of OpEx? So if you're looking at, and I'm sorry to get use acronyms, but the promise at first with AI and these big LLMs was that the LLMs were just going to keep getting cheaper and cheaper over time. Well, we've seen with the launch of Mythos that it actually kind of has gone like that. And if I want to put something innovative in a game right now, like I want you to shape your world as a player, because that's a cool thing. If you take your Fallout example, what if I could create a new character in the game as a player by typing something in? I don't know if you guys remember the game Scribblenauts, which is a classic. That's a good thing to nod at. But you could just type in the word or draw in the word shark, and a shark would appear in your game, and that's how you solve a puzzle. Well, if I could type in a few words and have a character created in Fallout, or if I wanted to have, say, a new settlement, but I want that settlement to be French Cajun, and to have that world have like some sort of spin on that sort of thing. You couldn't do that before. And you really can't do it now with an LLM without exploding your budget and putting that into the hands of your players. But I'm totally leading into what this is, what Overpowered is, like seeing what Daniel's already demoed for me in terms of what he's built, and knowing what an SLM can do. When you could put an SLM just on a Mac Mini or 10 Mac Minis, basically local hardware, then that means that I can give players things, basically creativity they couldn't have before. And I, as a creator, I then can do that creativity myself. So the other problem, and this is again playing into kind of Patrick's superpower, being a lawyer who loves games and is thinking about these things. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I am not a lawyer, and I'm aware of the chain of custody issues, but I don't know how to solve that in terms of doing that. Basically, most game companies are going to have to literally put lawyers and process in place so that when you create an AI asset, do you as a game company own it? Like, that is a problem. If I'm going to say create logos for my sports teams in my games, do I own them? In some cases, maybe that's not a problem. In others, that could be a problem. What if I create a character in my game that I want to then merchandise later or sell as IP? What actually protects that? So what's really exciting for me about what they're building is this chain of custody, is that if I can just have that sort of, I know I have ownership over what I'm doing into my workflows, just the process that I'm doing anyways to create, that creates a lot of de-risking for me. And I'm not aware of that really happening anywhere else in the industry. So things like that, basically, how do we work AI into a way that makes games more exciting, but also doesn't explode our costs, is a lot of what the challenges are right now.
I love the Scribblenauts example. I hadn't thought about that one in a minute, and it is, wow, that is a game idea that would certainly be meeting the moment for today. Quite extraordinary potential.
Well, and I've seen examples of this being done in other games, but they're running on either Google, heavily subsidized. How does that game maintain? We were talking about Stop Killing Games. What happens when just Google isn't subsidizing that particular game studio, or the overall token cost isn't being subsidized? So if I can build in a way that I know what my costs are going to be, I can design against, which is how we've always made games. We know what hardware we have to run against. We know what our server capacity is. Hopefully we're wrong and we need way more server capacity than we need. But for a general, we have an idea of that. And that's not the world we're living in right now. But that's part of the promise of what I see in Overpowered.
Okay, so I want to save us time here. I have two more questions. One for you and one for Daniel. So for you, I'd like to know, how is it that you think costs have sort of run away from the modern game making process? And how is it that time budgets seem to be just spiraling out of control? Both of those things just keep telescoping. And how is Overpowered a great answer to some of those?
Well, I mean, the scope of what's needed to be made for, I don't specialize in AAA games. I've worked on some of them, but that's not my specialty. But even in these smaller games, you're competing against studios with very large teams, maybe in China or Vietnam. And so, if you want to compete, you have to be able to do things at a scale that is bigger than your head count would suggest. So, in that sense, things that basically allow you to do things that would require a lot of people doing something manually that's maybe not totally exciting, but has to be done to make the world feel as rich and as big as it needs to be, make the content feel as deep as it needs to be. That's partly what the promise of AI in general is supposed to be, but specifically some of the stuff that I've seen Daniel build, and in general the stuff that building on an SLM based architecture as opposed to a let's hope Claude doesn't, increase their prices tomorrow again sort of architecture. So that's where a lot of I see the opportunity here.
Okay, thank you. So Daniel, question I had for you. So bear with me here. So, thinking about the potentials for creative IP development through Overpowered system, how is it that Overpowered is going to be able to create, vibrant new IP that are going to grab people, but that isn't going to feel derivative, that isn't going to feel like, people keep throwing the word around like AI slop? What are the ways that you've solved for that? And you're going to allow for the creation of distinct, just engaging IP that grabs the market's attention.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess the answer comes in two parts. So the first part is your research, basically. So how do you research what IP people are hungry for? And also, how do you figure out how to fit your initial ideas with something that is going to scale as a popular game? And so that's the first half of the process as a creative force, as a creative company. And that's what Patrick has figured out in his pipeline of how do you actually figure out what you want to build, come up with a cohesive plan for how you're going to build it, understand how it might be received, and predict some of the challenges that you might face as you're building that out. And then at that point of the process, once you have built out your full initial idea and you vetted it, that gets passed along to the system that I built. And so my system, it's a neurosymbolic AI system. We take that initial idea, we define all of the facts and truths and parameters and realities about it. And then from there, you can drill down or drill in whatever direction you want to add more nuance, to add more creativity, to add genealogies, to add settlements, to add geography, to add history, to add time, to add all of these different layers that would enrich that initial idea. And not just enrich them, but enrich them in a controllable way. So it's not just a bunch of hallucinations where a statistical model is producing some output that you can't necessarily replicate every time, or you're trying really hard to do the right prompt engineering to get the same kind of results. Because it's a neurosymbolic system where we're using both statistical and that old school symbolic AI that gamers have always been comfortable with and have always loved, and it's really always been there in gaming from the beginning, we are able to build a system that is creative, it's nuanced, it's expansive, but it's also maintainable, it's transparent, and it's something that doesn't feel like it's derivative to the end player.
Okay, great answer. And I'm going to be very excited to see what your dream engine produces. Should be a lot of fun for everybody. But I think we're just about at time here. Thank you so much for joining me, everybody. This has been Overpowered. Very excited to see where they go next. Game development is up against it, and I think that you guys really have the answer that so many studios are looking for. Thank you for joining us, and follow Overpowered on socials. And everybody have a great day.